Howdy, gang, and welcome once again to the Duct Tape Studios. I'm Jeff McAleer, your host, here at the Gaming Gang channel. Thanks for joining me once again. Today, I am going to share my review of Tales of the Valiant's Player's Guide from Kobold Press. This is written by Celeste Konowich with J.B. Little, Sarah Madsen, and Sebastian Rombach. The 384-page hardcover is available now, carries an MSRP of $59.99, or you can grab just the PDF alone over at DriveThruRPG for $34.99. All that said, let's swing on over to the other camera because here I've got Tales of the Valiant's Player's Guide. A few things to mention before we get stuck in. First of all, my friends over at Kobold Press were kind enough to provide me with this review copy. But neither I nor anyone else affiliated with the Gaming Gang has received any other sort of compensation for me to share this review with you. These days, it's very important you know that. We're also not going to look at each and every page of the book, but I want to give you a very good feel for what you're going to find inside this player's guide. And then lastly, how you feel about Tales of the Valiant is going to depend a lot on how you feel about 5e Dungeons & Dragons, because this is very 5e adjacent. And we're going to get into more detail about that in just a few moments. But if you despise 5e Dungeons & Dragons mechanically, you're probably not going to be too keen on Tales of the Valiant. Now, if you happen to like 5e D&D mechanically, systematically, so forth, you're probably going to enjoy Tales of the Valiant. So there you have that. Once again, I'll get in more detail in a few moments. First of all, let's take a look at the credits page because there were quite a lot of people involved in bringing this book to the masses. So we're going to give some credit where credit is due. So as far as the production quality, the paper stock, pretty solid. It feels a little bit thicker than what we would normally find in, say, a Wizards of the Coast Dungeons & Dragons release, but it is certainly not the thickest paper stock that I have seen in role-playing game books by any stretch of the imagination. The binding seems pretty solid. Artwork throughout, good, maybe not phenomenal. There are a few pieces that I take a peek at, and for some reason, they just seem off to the naked eye, but pretty good throughout. I do like the artwork, and I must also mention that we have a lot of action shots. So we are not looking at artwork of various different characters baking cakes or knitting socks or getting ready to go spend the afternoon over at the hacienda. So that is very important too. So at least these pieces of art will normally get your creative juices flowing a bit. And I do like that quite a lot. If you're not overly familiar with Tales of the Valiant, it is an epic fantasy role-playing game in the mold of Dungeons & Dragons. So this is not a low magic sort of setting by any stretch of the imagination. It is epic fantasy. So we're going to start off with the various different classes and your character creation. Now, I will say that to my unexperienced eye, as far as Tales of the Valiant having not run it, it does look as if the characters will start with a bit more baseline power right off the bat at first level, more so than 5e Dungeons & Dragons, which might surprise some folks out there. But in a lot of ways, there's also some additional kind of squishiness to the characters. I think it's easier for the characters to be defeated and the characters end up being killed during the adventure than you might see in 5e. So as far as the classes go, there are tweaks throughout. I will say that I found the Barbarian, the Warlock, the Warrior to be pretty interesting as far as the retooling that has taken place. And there's also the Mechanist, which is sort of an artificer sort of character, which is brought into the classes here too. One thing that's important to keep in mind as far as Tales of the Valiant, as your characters level up, each and every level, they are going to receive something new to that character. So that is one of the big selling points of Tales of the Valiant compared to, say, 5e D&D. I will also admit, I do not know much about the new, not new edition of Dungeons and Dragons, which is arriving this year. At least the player's handbook is arriving this year. I have not looked at the playtest materials or anything like that. I do understand that there are some things in Tales of the Valiant which are new, which are also in the new, not new edition of D&D, which is on the horizon. So keep that in mind. To be very honest, I can't get into a lot of depth about that, once again, because I have not taken a look at the playtest materials. If you follow the Gaming Gang, you know I do not have the greatest relationship anymore with Wizards of the Coast. I don't really have a beef with them all that much. They just don't appreciate that I'm very honest in my reviews. So there is that. So your character creation, you've got 3 different methods. You can go about it. You can roll dice, but you are going to be rolling 4d6, toss out the lowest. There's also a point buy, or you can just go with a standard kit where it's like, okay, so you got 1 attribute at 16, 2 at 14, so on and so forth. You will also have some additional bonuses you add to those numbers. As I had pointed out, power level wise, the starting characters in Tales of the Valiant seem to be a tad bit more powerful than even first level characters in 5e. So just going through all of these, you're going to see the various different abilities that these classes will have, the class features. We also have subclasses, which I would have liked to have seen more of. Each of the classes have a couple of subclasses. I'd like to have seen 3, maybe even 4. I do sort of have the feeling that depending on how well Tales of the Valiant does, and of course, this had a massive Kickstarter, we might actually see some supplemental material down the line, which will feature some additional classes, some additional subclasses too. I can say, even though we don't have a ton of subclasses, they are good. They are solid. Then we'll get into the various different heritages, and then we'll have backgrounds. So there are a lot of ways for the players to custom craft the sort of adventurer they want to take on the role of. So that's very nicely done as well. We have various different talents. I will say everything in the core mechanics of Tales of the Valiant is very, very similar, if not identical, to 5e D&D. Keep that in mind. I will also say that I love how we got pictures of the different pieces of armor, the armor sets, as well as different weapons. I am always a big fan of that because not everybody knows the difference between a flail and a morning star or a pike and a halberd. So I like that quite a bit. We will eventually get into how to play the game. So interestingly enough, we get the character creation, we get gear, we get a real extensive section on magical items and such before we even get into the rules of gameplay. So I thought that was kind of an interesting approach to the layout of this book. I didn't really have an issue with it, though. I mean, I was fine with it. Many of the magic items are pretty standard. Of course, obviously enough, this is no longer subject to the open game license. That was really the whole point of flying the black flag, was to get rid of any sort of obligations to Wizards of the Coast. Plenty of publishers out there doing the same thing. So that's where Tales of the Valiant comes from as far as with many of the aspects and magic spells and magic items. if they're not subject to copyright through Wizards of the Coast, then they are in here. So now we get into the actual gameplay. And if you're not overly familiar with 5e D&D, then your action resolution is pretty standard for regardless what you're trying to accomplish. So they're called checks here in Tales of the Valiant. And we have 3 different kinds of checks. We have attack rolls. We also have saves. And then we have checks. So funny enough, it's laid out that there's 3 different kinds of checks, but only one is called a check. I thought that was a little odd, might be a little confusing for people who are not familiar with tabletop role-playing games. Speaking of that, this is designed for people who have some sort of experience with role-playing games, in my opinion. Now, yes, we get that traditional section to start off the book. What is a role-playing game? What kind of dice do you use? And so on and so forth. But we do not get examples throughout this. We have most of the information presented in short bursts, very concise, which I appreciate. I do like that. But I'm also someone who has decades of experience with role-playing games. Now, we will get some sidebars, such as advice boxes and things like that. But as far as examples of play, detailed examples, you will not find those present. So what you're going to do is you are going to roll a 20-sided die, and you're going to have various different modifiers. So you'll have ability modifiers. So your attributes are going to provide modifiers. And there is quite a bit larger swing with the 3 to 18. So if you have a 3, it's a -4. If you have an 18, it's +4. So a little more swing with those modifiers as opposed to most role-playing games that use modifiers for the 3 to 18 attribute range. We also will have proficiency bonuses that might be added to that D20 roll. And of course, if you're using a piece of gear, a piece of equipment that has a positive or possibly negative modifier, you're going to be dealing with that as well. Math-wise, really same amount of math involved in Tales of the Valiant as you would find in 5e. So you're going to have a target number. Now, it might be a challenge rating based on what you're attempting to do. It could be armor class. Regardless, you're going to have a number that you're looking to meet or exceed on a 20-sided die in order to succeed. Easy enough. If you hit, you roll your damage dice that is applied to the hit points of your target. Of course, if you're hit by enemies, then of course you will apply damage to your hit points, so on and so forth. So we'll get into the details about healing, death. The death concept here is if you hit 0 hit points, you are dying. If you ever take your normal number of hit points as a negative, so let's say you started off, you've got a dozen hit points, and you're taken to -12 hit points, well, then your character is now going to be taking a dirt nap. That's how that works. Now, there are death saves that can be made. There are critical hits. There are critical failures, as we're used to seeing in 5e. So natural 20 is going to give you a critical success, critical hit, what have you. And a natural 1 is going to be a critical failure. So you'll have a death save that you'll be making. And it is possible to have a critical failure on that. And if you fail your death save 3 times, you're done. You're out. You are buying the farm, so to speak. As far as combat goes, it's got a little more of a tactical feel than maybe 5e D&D, just a hair. But this is not a highly tactical sort of combat system for this role-playing game. So this is still a lot of theater of the mind. Now, granted, of course, you can use miniatures, you can use mats and all that other stuff too. Not a problem. And we actually just past the section which was showing the size of creatures and how many squares they take up on a grid. We get a bit of information about downtime, but the actual rules of play consist of a little more than 30 pages. So not very complex. Like I said, everything is very concise, which for some people like myself is great. For other people who are newer to the hobby, maybe not so much. The greatest amount of page space is devoted to spellcasting. And with spellcasting, the spell levels are now gone. We now have circles. So the lower the circle, the less powerful the spell. The higher the circle, obviously enough, the more powerful the spell. We also have cantrips and we have rituals. So we still have spell slots. We still have preparation of spells for clerics and wizards. Any other magic using class does not have to prepare spells, which I got to be honest, if you're going to get rid of spell preparation for a lot of classes, you might as well just get rid of them for all the classes. But it does make things a little bit different. And the cleric and wizard do kind of make up for the fact that they have to prepare their spells. So you're going to see here that we've got all the information about the various spells, and they are broken up alphabetically. They are not broken up by circle level. See, now I almost said spell level. And we have about, off the top of my head, about 130 pages devoted to spells and spellcasting. And I really do appreciate that we have just short information here. We do not have to be sitting there reading through a page and a half, 2 pages just for a spell. So I do like that. As far as this converting to 5e D&D and 5e D&D converting to this, not a lot of issues. There are a couple of new mechanics which are included, and essentially they are player and game master currencies. So we do have luck. So players can gain luck in a few different ways. Number one, every time they fail a roll, they're going to get a point of luck. Now, the game master can also give them luck for good role playing or clever ideas, things like that. And the players can also earn luck by successfully navigating a difficult challenge. Now, one of the nice things about luck is that it is not up to the game master's whim, like inspiration would be in 5e D&D. Players know they're going to get luck points when they fail a roll. Now, luck can be spent in a few different ways. So mainly, you can spend 1 point of luck to increase your die roll by 1. You can spend 3 points of luck in order to re-roll the die completely. Now, you cannot use luck to improve a critical failure, and you cannot use luck to buy your way into a critical success. So that's important to keep in mind too. Now, the game master, they have got their own currency. It's Doom. And they spend Doom points in order to boost the abilities of the adversaries that the player characters are facing off with. Now, I have to point out, these are not new concepts in role-playing games by any stretch of the imagination, but they are new to 5e adjacent role-playing games, to my knowledge. So I do like those as well. I got to be really honest, and I'll get more into this when I share my final thoughts and provide Tales of the Valiant a review score. Honestly, I think this is way too similar to 5e D&D to make it truly stand out. There are tweaks here and there. I like the tweaks, but the reality is the problems that some gamers have with 5e D&D mechanically and systematically and just design theory-wise are still present. So there still is going to be that imbalance between the martial classes and spellcasting classes. It's baked into this cake because it's essentially baked into the D&D cake as well. So important to keep that in mind. Now we're going to wrap up with a short bestiary, and then we'll have our index here, character sheet, and that is what you're going to find inside Tales of the Valiant's Player's Guide from Kobold Press. So let's swing on over to the other camera because I am going to share my final thoughts and give this a review score. So I want to say I like Tales of the Valiant. I do. I really do. One of the big questions I always ask myself when I'm doing my final thoughts and trying to prepare a review score is, would I run this game? When I'm reviewing a core rulebook, it's, would I run this? Can I see myself running this game with my group? And yes, I could. I could easily see that. If you like 5e Dungeons & Dragons, but maybe you don't like the shenanigans of the parent company, or maybe the direction that it's been taking as of late over the past couple of years or more, kind of leaves you cold, then I would say, yeah, by all means, you'll probably want to take a look at Tales of the Valiant because it's not radically different than 5e Dungeons & Dragons. There are some tweaks here and there. There are, some adjustments to the classes. Now, I do like the Mechanist class because we got that new, Artificer class, which we see in other role-playing games as well. I thought that was well done. So for the most part, the tweaks that have been made to the character classes, as well as the subclasses, are well done. I do like them. But the reality is, you might just use some of this stuff just to kit bash with your 5e Dungeons & Dragons already. If you don't care for 5e D&D just as a game itself, regardless of creators or parent company, you're not going to care for Tales of the Valiant because at its heart, it is very adjacent to 5e Dungeons & Dragons. It does not address major issues that gamers have with the core mechanics and the design philosophy of Dungeons & Dragons. It just does not. So I don't see this appealing to people who just don't care for 5e D&D. I will say I'm kind of disappointed with the Player's Guide for Tales of the Valiant because during the open game license fiasco, as I like to refer to it, Kobold Press said, hey, we're flying the black flag. We're going to bust out. We are going to create our own role-playing game system. And it will be built on the skeleton of Dungeons & Dragons. Essentially, that's what they were talking about. And then when Wizards of the Coast ended up backpedaling on the whole open game license fiasco, which, funny enough, I took a lot of heat online because I said Wizards of the Coast is going to cave, and everybody thought I was nuts. I understand how corporations work. But when they backpedaled and suddenly made Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition and earlier editions Creative Commons, that's, no pun intended, took some of the wind out of the Black Flag sails. And then there was the change in title, which, let's be honest, Black Flag role-playing doesn't really jump out at you. Tales of the Valiant does, right? It's like, yeah, heroic fantasy, I gotcha, sure. But I think when that open game license fiasco kind of died out, I believe Kobold Press sort of lost their direction on what they wanted to do with Tales of the Valiant. And unfortunately, and I can understand why they did this, because economically it makes sense. Kobold Press is well known for their excellent 5e third-party content. So you're not going to kill off the golden goose and release your own role-playing game that's not going to be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons, nor the content you're already selling. So I get that. But I honestly wish it was more different than 5e Dungeons and Dragons, because I think it would set it apart from all the other, as people like to refer them, D&D likes or D&D alikes, because I don't think there's enough here to really set Tales of the Valiant in its own space. I think it's just kind of floating around the orbit of 5e Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that's unfortunate, because there are a lot of cool things in this book. I just don't think enough eyes are going to eventually get on it outside of those who backed the very successful Kickstarter. So even though I do like Tales of the Valiant's Player's Guide, I would run Tales of the Valiant. I think all in all, this Player's Guide is a bit of a disappointment. I do recommend it, but it's all going to depend on how you already feel about 5e Dungeons and Dragons. So on a scale of 0 to 10, I give the Player's Guide for Tales of the Valiant a 6 out of 10. Once again, recommend it. It's all going to have to do with how you feel about D&D. And I would have liked to have seen this be more than it actually boils down to. Now, stay tuned, because tomorrow I'll be sharing my review of the Monster Vault for Tales of the Valiant. And I can tell you right now, little spoiler, I like that a whole hell of a lot more than the Player's Guide. So be sure to catch that video when you have a chance. All right, that's it for this time out. If you like the video, by all means, please give it a quick thumbs up. Subscribe to the Gaming Gang channel if you haven't already. And if you do subscribe, don't forget, ring that bell, because it'll not only let you know when I share videos such as this review, it'll also inform you when my live stream, the Gaming Gang Dispatch, airs Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday evenings right here on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central. Of course, when you're not watching videos on the Gaming Gang channel, be sure to visit thegaminggang.com for all latest in tabletop gaming news, reviews, and a whole lot more you are not going to find on YouTube. You know the drill. Get your geek on at thegaminggang.com. Thank you very much for watching. Once again, I'm Jeff McAleer. And until I see you next time, I certainly hope all of you get to enjoy plenty of great gaming with your gang.